Mr. Stupak.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
At the desk.
Yes, I have an amendment at the desk. It's amendment number 2.
Without objection, the amendment will be considered as read. Gentleman recognized for 5 minutes to explain his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And as I said earlier, I wished I could have offered this one before Mr. Blunt's amendment. I think Mr. Blunt's amendment was well intended, but lacked some specificity, and hopefully we can bring some further specificity to what is unserved and underserved areas. Mr. Dingell and Mr. Terry made a lot of good comments last time about the areas where there's no definitions out there, and we do not want to leave it to the FCC. So what my amendment requires that the FCC review and revise its definitions of unserved and underserved areas after completion of the broadband inventory map. Currently, our federal agencies do lack the empirical data on the status of broadband deployment in this country. So it's my concern that the definitions the FCC will create to designate what is an unserved or underserved area may not be accurate. Congress addressed a similar issue with the Rural Utilities Service Broadband Program under the Farm Bill. And thanks to Mr. Markey's legislation on broadband map in 2007, we had a number of hearings on it. Congress had input on that broadband map legislation Mr. Markey passed. And also in the Rural Utilities Service Broadband Program, since I helped write the program 6-7 years ago, this was the first time we've had a chance to reauthorize it. And with the reauthorization, because of input from members and hearings we had, in the Rural Utilities Service Broadband Program, they do provide some criteria, specific criteria, such as changes were made to tighten up the areas to be eligible to receive loans in the RUS in a way that should exclude suburban areas that are already well served. As examples Mr. Terry brought up, areas are not eligible if they receive service by 3 or more broadband providers, or more than 75% of the households may obtain affordable broadband service from at least one incumbent provider, and the areas are contiguous to an urban center, are of at least 50,000, nor have a population exceeding 20,000. In other words, you can't be more than 20,000, but you can't be adjacent to an area of 50,000 population. So we do have some criteria to go by. But prior to the Farm Bill, funding was going to areas that met the criteria issued by the Department of Ag, but were not truly rural in nature, and I brought up the subdivision within Houston. So what we're doing here, is when we revise the definition of the RUS in the Farm Bill to tighten the criteria of eligibility and more efficiently target our funds to areas that need them, the FCC should undergo a similar process upon completion of the broadband deployment map by the NTIA. That way we can ensure that areas that are truly underserved and unserved receive future funding. We've argued basically this amendment on the Blunt amendment, so I just ask my colleagues to support this amendment to bring some specificity and uniformity of what is unserved and underserved based upon the criteria of the broadband deployment map. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Stupak. Is there a discussion or opposition? Mr. Barton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I didn't speak on the Blunt amendment, and I'm not going to speak at length on the Stupak amendment, but I think what Mr. Blunt said on his amendment bears repeating on this amendment. If we as a committee feel like there should, be grants to underserved areas of America, we ought to put it in the statute. We don't need to let the Commission have a study. We could have a debate in this committee or subcommittee and then decide if underserved means one provider that has less than 50% market penetration, so be it. If it means 2 providers, none of which is dominant, so be it. But to say that, I understand the gentleman from Michigan's intent here, and it is an improvement in the underlying bill because at least he requires there be some definition, and that's a good thing, not a bad thing. But I think there are enough bright minds on this committee, maybe even one or two on the minority side of the aisle, that we could work this out and put it in the statute. So I would, I'm not saying I'm really opposed to this. I don't see why we don't do what Mr. Blunt said, is decide what we want, a definition of underserved, and put it in the bill. And with that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back the balance of his time. Are we ready for the question on the...
Move to strike the last word.
Gentleman's recognized. Gentleman from Oregon.
I'd just like to, if the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Stupak, could help me walk through the timelines here. Your amendment would say that not later than 3 months, then, after the date the NTIA makes broadband inventory map available, the FCC would go back through and revise their definitions accordingly. Is that the crux of this?
That's the crux of it. After 90 days, they have 45 more days to get through the rules and regulations.
Then what impact does that have on the underlying bill on page 3, where the states are only given 75 days after enactment to write and submit their plans? Because it looks to me like we've just moved the goalposts on them with a requirement of the FCC to redefine underserved.
Well, hell, the whole bill.
And yet the states within 75 days of enactment are supposed to have their plans in place. So is that going to require, if the FCC changes the definition after NTIA comes in, then aren't the states going to have to revise all their submitted plans?
Not necessarily. Just of the states right now, I think both you and Mr. Terry both point out that you have different criteria that your state will use is probably different than Michigan right now. Until we get an inventory map, until the Markey legislation that we passed in 2007, until we have that information, they'll probably end up continue to put out these grants the way they have been right now, which quite honestly has been based upon political influence and earmarks. So this administration is trying to say we're not going to do political influence or earmarks. Let's base it on something.
Reclaiming
You're
my
right.
time,
States
though.
are going to have to look at it differently.
Right, I understand that, but the language that we're putting into statute says not later than 75 days after the date of enactment of this section, each state intending to participate in the program under this section shall submit to the NTIA a report indicating the geographic areas of the state which, and then it goes through, and included in that is which wireless voice service in unserved areas and underserved areas, the same for broadband.
Correct.
That definition is what we've been debating this morning, that's going to be defined by the FCC, now further revised after the maps come in, and yet in order to participate, the states have to submit this plan in 75 days describing what areas of theirs are underserved, but then we're going to change the definition on them. So they're going to have to resubmit their plans in order to qualify because the definition could change.
Well, hopefully once they submit their plans, you were trying to deploy the money, they're not going to let them wait for a year or so before do it that we'll deploy the money. Do they have to resubmit the plans? I guess that's an administrator's judgment, but I would say no. But look, right now we don't have anything federally. How we've been doing it?
All right.
Based upon the applications.
I just want,
I
know that I'm going to hear from my public utility commissioner, my governor, or somebody that says, doggone you guys, you told us to go down this route. The FCC in 45 days gave us a definition. We went to work and we crashed out in 30 days a plan that details everything, including a concrete plan for computer acquisition. And then you've come back and you've changed the description of what underserved is, and now our plan won't be in compliance.
No, I don't think that's at all. I would hope the NTIA, as you're applying, if Oregon applies for a grant here and to give specific information, that will help them, NTIA, to do their broadband
But
map.
again, reclaiming my time, everything else, the underlying document talks about whatever definition the FCC puts forward in 45 days, the state only has 30 days to write their plan, and everything's predicated on their definition of the original FCC definition.
And
I think it's going to set up a real mess. I just want to put that on the record. Yes, certainly.
But, I mean, right now you got 50 different ways of defining. If you look, each state does it
Oh, I
differently.
don't argue that point.
So after you have your standard, shouldn't a state then comply to the federal rules? Yeah.
Right, but what we're doing is creating one standard in 45 days after
Right, and then you get
enactment.
30 days after. You get a little pressure on the states, right.
Well, but wait, because then you're going to come back with your amendment with the new NTIA data from the maps.
Correct.
And have the FCC review that and come up with a revised definition of underserved. And now the states are going to have to go through and revise all their plans because we didn't set the definition here right now.
And while the FCC is doing their revisions, I'm sure, knowing your interest in this area, you'll be helping the FCC make those determinations. It's going to give
Well,
all of us an opportunity to make
Well,
it.
my
and argue.
interests aside, and I would be more than happy to be cooperative on all of it. I don't know, maybe 21 years in small business, I used to get really angry when the government moved the goalposts on me. And I'm afraid that's what we're setting up here, is the government's going to send the states down this direction and this path, and then in whatever timeline is in 3 months, the FCC is going to change where the goalposts are, and there's going to have to be a complete rewriting of these state plans.
Right, but when we try to kick that field goal, we'll have one field goal as opposed to 50 different field goals, and then we get some uniformity in definitions of unserved, underserved.
Waxman?
All time has expired. Any further discussion on this side? Mr. Boyer?
Mr. Waxman, I have an amendment to the amendment, and the amendment is at the desk. I have a second-degree amendment. If you could pass out the amendment.
Reserving a point of order.
Gentleman reserves a point of order. I don't think it's... I don't think, if the gentleman would permit, I don't think a second-degree amendment would be permitted because we didn't make the amendment in the nature of a substitute, the base text. And when Mr. Stupak tried to use his amendment as a substitute amendment to Mr. Blunt, there was objection. So if you wish to ask unanimous consent, you could do that, but otherwise, without unanimous consent, I don't think you'd be permitted to offer it as a substitute amendment.
You will you're going to rule out of order a second-degree amendment?
We have as
My amendment already is second-degree amendment to the chairman's amendment. We're working off that
This
one.
is the third. This would be
third degree.
You're correct. a
Which is
third-degree
not
amendment.
appropriate.
All right. I would ask unanimous consent.
Well, wait, parliamentary inquiry.
Yes, gentleman stays parliamentary inquiry.
When we began the markup, my staff indicates to me that you offered an amendment in the nature of a substitute as a
Yes.
base text. Is that correct?
Well, I offered an amendment in the nature of a substitute for the purposes of amendment, and then I asked unanimous consent that all amendments that were drafted to the bill be considered as designed to the amendment to the nature
And
of
we
the
agreed with
substitute.
that. But your initial request, you did offer an amendment in the nature of a substitute.
Yes.
My parliamentarian says if that's the case, Mr. Booyer doesn't need unanimous consent because the amendment under the rules is in order.
Well, that's
Now,
what
I'm not saying that that's true. I'm just saying that's what my
Yeah.
parliamentarian
Well, my
said.
parliamentarian's telling me something different. I would like any way we can proceed in the most orderly way possible. Mr. Stupak?
Mr. Chairman, well, you offered an amendment in the nature of substitute. It hasn't been voted on. It's still an amendment, still pending.
Still pending.
Yeah, we haven't
Okay.
accepted it
And
yet.
your
If we would have accepted it, it would have been a substitute. We have not accepted it as a substitute, so mine's a second-degree amendment to the Waxman amendment. So now you become to a third degree. And
Well,
Mr. Chairman,
depending whether or not it's a hybrid.
There's a question for unanimous consent. Now, Mr. Stupak, this is an amendment in the amendment to your amendment. The question is not whether you approve it, but are you willing to let it be offered as a second degree to yours?
No, we've beat this one to death. No, I object.
So let's dispose of Mr. Stupak's amendment first.
Well, then, may I be recognized to speak?
Yes, gentleman's recognized.
Move to strike the last word. And I think what would be helpful for the members is for the two parliamentarians to please contact our head parliamentarian to find out, because a lot of business for which we do here in Congress, Chairman will offer that substitute, and then we go through the amendment process. And even when I chaired on Veterans Affairs, I would permit a second-degree amendment on a substitute. So I would like for all of us, for our own edification, I think it would be helpful to us.
Mr. Chairman,
Parliamentary
parliamentary clarification.
Gentlemen,
All right, I yield. Well, I no longer have the time then, if it's parliamentary inquiry.
Mr. Barden, state your parliamentary inquiry.
Well, I'm a stickler for rules and due process, but what I said earlier was an error. You did not offer an amendment in the nature of a substitute. You did not offer a manager's amendment, so it does require unanimous consent. So Mr. Stupak is within his rights to object to the unanimous consent request because you didn't offer a manager's amendment in the nature of a substitute, which I was told initially that you did. You did not do that, so it does require unanimous consent.
Okay, thanks. In the meantime, Mr. Boyer wished to be recognized to speak on the the pending Stupak amendment. Gentleman's recognized.
Thank you. And is all that time counted against me, Mr.
Now,
Chairman?
I'm going to start you all over.
Thank you. I want to compliment Mr. Stupak because you're trying to you're helping. You're trying to make something here. You're trying to be very helpful, and I agree with you that having this map is extremely important for us to be able to make good judgments. And so what I was about to do, Mr. Stupak, in amending your amendment is when you say that we shall, you're going to extend to the FCC then, based on this map, that you can revise the definitions based then on the data. If you're going to revise the definitions, then why wouldn't you also then revise the allocation? Because that's what's so extremely important. And so what I was going to propose in your, to amend your amendment would be to revise the allocation. I guess what I'll do now, since you objected to that amendment, is I will wait and pause and see the outcome of your amendment, and then may offer my own then amendment. But Mr. Stupak, I would just like to enter this colloquy with you, is that because those definitions are extremely important, and I can't in good conscience place myself to defend the 75% that want to put themselves back in the food line. And so if we want to make sure that everyone is covered, would it not be logical then for us to, Mr. Stupak, to then say, if we're going to revise definitions based on the map, that we should also take a second look at the allocation? And I yield to the gentleman.
I wasn't in the room when the allocations came up. There are two different sources. If I had my way, it'd be 100%, and it'd go to the 1st Congressional District of Michigan. And that's why we're not all in the room. I'm sure there's some logic to 75, 25, 80, 20 as we see in this legislation, but I'm not privy to those discussions, so I guess I really couldn't tell you, to be honest, Steve.
Well, then,
I yield back.
Reclaiming my time, do you know who was in the room?
Nope.
Well, then, if we're trying to make logically based decisions, that's what you're doing here, would the gentleman agree that we should also revisit the allocation percentage based off the outcome of the map, Mr. Stupak? I yield to you.
Again, I think if we take a look at the full bill, I think there's allocations made, and I think there's some logic to it. Should we redo it? No, I don't think that's in the purview of this committee.
So, I'm sorry, I didn't hear the...
No, I don't think we really should do a reallocation. Why? Because I think we have an administration, we have a Senate, we have the House. Leadership has all conferred and put together this package, and there's some things I think we can. Remember, these are not hard set goals. It's got to be 75, 25. Aspirational goals is a new one I heard today, and I aspire to get all of it to my district.
All right, we'll reclaim my time. It doesn't, in the bill, it doesn't say aspirational goal, nor does it intend for it to be an aspirational goal. It actually states the 75-25. It uses the word shall, and then it uses some language. Let me move to it. What, to the extent possible or something like that?
I think it says shall seek. That's where I get aspirational goal, shall seek.
Wow, boy, we're just gonna abdicate a lot of our responsibilities over to the FCC. I just pause and remember when Republicans were in the majority, when you were fighting in the minority, you would never have taken this position that you're taking today, and I'm really stunned. I think one of the things that we have to do, and Republicans now when we find ourselves in the minority, we also have to be very careful in keeping ourselves to what are your values, what are your principles, what do you believe in the best interests of the country, and I believe you should be doing the very same thing. Don't fight one way when you're in the minority, but when you're in the majority, then you do something completely different. Definitions are important, allocations are important, and I'm going to go back to my comment about value-based policy judgments for a country. We shouldn't be saying to the other 75%, it's okay to cut into the food line before the other 25 people have even gotten fed yet. And that's what we're doing with regard to broadband services. And I applaud Mr. Stupak. You recognize that. You're trying to make that kind of change. But when it comes to then to the allocation of the money needs to follow the map. So I applaud the gentleman for his intentions. I yield to the gentleman if he would like that.
Well, thanks. And again, a little flippant there on the amounts. I all want to go to my district. I think we all want to. But what my amendment's trying to do is build off what we did in the last Congress. When we had the Markey legislation, we had a number of hearings on unserved, underserved, And we finally got something to say, okay, let's do a broadband deployment map so we all know what we're going from, what we're all working off of. Even the FCC thought it was a good idea because we had a number of hearings with the FCC in there. Right now, the FCC is down to 3 members, and so I'm just saying, look, let's build off what we've been doing for the last 2 years under the leadership of Mr. Markey in this and deploy it that way. Maybe after we get that map, you might be right, Mr. Booyer. Maybe we should reallocate the 75-25. You may be right. I want to take it one step at a time. Let's get a map. Let's get some common definitions we can all use from, and let's work from there. And that's why, in a way, I know it's a new definition, shall seek. We call it aspirational, but gives us some room to maneuver in the future, and I appreciate what you're trying to do. Thank you.
No. Gentleman's time has expired.
Move to strike the last word.
Well, let me announce to the members, we have a 2-hour limit on this committee print. I know of a couple of amendments, and we'll probably have votes. Of course, we won't count that time. So unless it's really urgent, I would hope we can get to the vote, but I'm not going to cut anybody off. Does anybody feel they absolutely must speak on the Stupak amendment?
Yes, I do. I'm
Okay,
sorry.
Mr. Cherry.
I move to strike the requisite number of words, and I'm not trying to cause problems. I'm extremely frustrated at so many different levels here. First of all, I've been working for 3 years on trying to make sure that we have a comprehensive, logical broadband policy that does do what we're talking about here, and that's, you know, kind of the man on the moon big picture thing. And to have 3 years of beating my head against a wall here, of trying to make it comprehensive and coordinated, and then to do it in a matter of 4 hours without any input, discussion, coordination, let's just throw $6 billion and not question how it's done or coordinated. It makes no sense to me and frustrates me to the core. Bart, I like what you're doing here, but it doesn't get to what the real issues are here, although we in Congress can't decide what underserved and unserved means until we get this data. The FCC can't. But that doesn't mean that we punt to the FCC on these type of issues, because it is going to mean in Nebraska, will that one house out in the middle of nowhere that's being unserved is underserved by some definition or not? That's a huge policy decision that this committee should decide. Now, I'm curious, Mr. Markey or Bart, somebody, do you know if the RUS $3 billion is all grant dollars or loan dollars?
The gentleman yield?
Yes, I yield to Mr. Markey.
It is all grant money.
Thank you. That's helpful to some extent, because most of RUS is loan dollars, so we don't get really anywhere. The other point, or one thing I would add that I do know, is that under current law, there is no obligation to use RUS dollars for unserved areas. So does anybody, Mr. Markey, would you know if under what the Ag Committee is doing, that they designate that a portion of their dollars has to be used for unserved areas, whatever that may mean by the FCC? And I would yield to you.
And I apologize to you. I do not know what the Agriculture Committee is doing on that.
I would appreciate that. Well, that begs the question.
Although all the money goes to rural America, okay? So I assume on the Agriculture...
No, it doesn't go.
Just assuming on the Agriculture Committee that there would be a lot of pressure to make sure that that was done correctly.
Well, that may be a true statement that there'd be a lot of pressure, but from experience, by law, they're not required and have seen fit to abrogate that when necessary. So I guess the bottom line here, and then I'll yield back, is that this is a monumental undertaking that we need to take, but doing it in a haphazard, uncoordinated way, and just saying the common goal here is to throw $6 billion at the problem and quit asking any questions simply is too frustrating to handle. And I yield back.
Gentleman yields back his time. We'll now proceed to the vote on the Stupak amendment. All those in favor of the Stupak amendment will say aye. Aye. Opposed, no. The ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to. Mr. Boyd.